This video is going to give you a brief introduction into analysing argument, including some of the key terms you're going to need to use when engaging with this component of the course. So before we go into it in a bit more detail, we're going to start off by going through a bit of a scenario. Let's imagine that the leadership of the school has released a new policy that says that no more class parties will be allowed. Now, of course, this has generated a lot of discussion around this central question of should class parties be allowed. One person, an opinion, has decided to write a response to this issue because she feels very strongly that class parties should be allowed, and that's what she's going to write about. Now, of course, Anne is aware that there are plenty of people who are affected by this particular central question and who may have particular viewpoints on this. So some of these people might be other students in the school, teachers, school leadership, parents, and even other people like cleaners as well. She knows as well that these groups feel different ways about this issue. So they have different values. Some groups might agree, some agree to an extent, some may disagree, and some may strongly disagree. And this will be affected by the particular values that they hold. Now, Anne has decided that she is going to write her piece with a particular set of these people in mind. So she's going to think about who she can target and who has shared values. And she's just going to select a few of those groups to write about. So in this instance, Anne has decided that she's going to write her piece targeting school management, teachers, and other students at the school. Now, we want to keep in mind that Anne believes that class parties should be allowed, but as we established just previously, a lot of these other groups don't necessarily agree with that. So it's going to be her job to change their point of view to align with her point of view. So as Anne writes, she'll be thinking about how she can make her readers think or feel certain ways so that they'll agree with her, because we know that they think or feel differently from her at this point in time. So, of course, she'll be keeping in mind what those particular groups care about. And when she thinks about that, she's going to use that to present to them certain justifications to support her point of view. So, for instance, she might appeal to this idea or this value of fun or relaxation, to target certain groups. She might target other groups by presenting reasons about learning. She might appeal to other groups by appealing to another shared value. Now, of course, it is Anne's hope here that eventually her audience will agree with her and that class parties will therefore be allowed. So let's return to the start of this scenario and apply some meta language that we're going to need to use as part of this element of the course. So when we're talking about meta language, we're talking about a form of language or a set of terms used for the description or analysis of language. So right back at the start, when the school issued this policy around no more class parties being allowed, and there was all of this discussion about this central question of should class parties be allowed, we consider that central question around which people have different point of views, we consider that the issue. So it's an important topic or problem for debate or discussion. The release of the policy was the context because it was the particular circumstances around which the issue has come to prominence. So within this context and in response to this particular issue, Anne Opinion piped up, and because she was writing something here, we would consider her the author. So when we're talking about analysing argument, our author is the person who has written the persuasive text. A persuasive text is a piece of writing that aims to convince readers of the author's point of view. So we know that Anne Opinion here was writing on this idea that class parties should be allowed. Now, we could call this her point of view, but when we're using precise meta language, we would refer to this as her contention. So her perspective or main argument in response to the issue. Now, when we thought about, or when Anne Opinion thought about these other groups that were also affected by this or who were interested in this, she was considering the stakeholders in this issue. So when we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about people or groups with an interest or concern in a particular issue. So people who are affected by them. Now, you would have noticed that one thing Anne Opinion did was she selected a certain group of stakeholders or certain groups of stakeholders to target in her piece of writing. She didn't target all stakeholders. She selected certain stakeholders. And those were the people to whom she was going to address her piece of writing. So they became then her audience. So they're the people or group for whom a writer writes. Now, it's important to keep in mind that persuasive texts do have specific audiences, and it's generally more specific than just all stakeholders. Generally, an author will have a more specific group in mind than that, and that is something really important to keep in mind. So perhaps obviously the author's purpose, when we're talking about persuasive texts, the author's purpose is to persuade the audience of a contention. So here, Anne Opinion wanted her audience to change their perspectives, because remember, some of them disagreed, some of them only agreed to an extent. She wanted them to change their opinion to align with hers that class parties should be allowed. Now, the next thing that we're talking about is really important, because we need to keep in mind that authors make deliberate choices in order to achieve this purpose. So they do more than simply share their opinion. They actually use language and arguments in specific ways to change these audience members' points of view. And this is the most important thing to keep in mind here, and is that these choices are deliberate and they aim to basically manipulate audiences. They do more than simply share an opinion. So one of the ways that Anne Opinion sought to position her audience was through the use of arguments. So remember, she considered the particular values that her audience held, and she constructed particular arguments in response to those particular values. The other thing that she did was she thought about particular language choices. So she thought about how she could make them think or feel in certain ways in order to achieve that purpose of getting them to change their point of view, because she wanted to position them in certain ways. What she did then was to target their particular values with the hope that appealing to what they held dear would cause them to agree with her. So basically, keeping all of this in mind, we can consider what this component of the course is asking us to do. So basically, analyzing argument asks us to understand that authors of persuasive texts use arguments and language to position audiences to agree with them. So that's the key understanding in this component of the course. The key skill that we are practicing is analyzing, so providing a detailed, methodical explanation and interpretation of how authors present their point of view with that purpose in mind of asking audiences to agree with them. So that's when all of these key terms that we just went through come into play. So broadly speaking, considering what the context is, what the particular issue is, who the author is and what their contention is, and who the target audience of a particular persuasive text is. Then we zoom in a little bit more closely, and that's where that really close analysis comes in. So we're considering what arguments are presented, what's the author's tone, how are they appealing to those particular values that their audience holds. How do they use language to persuade, and how do they use visuals to persuade? So in short, it's your job to analyze how the author's language and argument are used to present a point of view. So if we summarize that in two broad categories, we can think about how the points that are made in relation to the author's contention position the audience to agree with the author's contention, but also how the language that they use, so their tone, their word choices, particular persuasive techniques they use, the visuals that they use, position the audience to agree as well. So basically, when we're doing this, it sounds really complicated. It sounds like we've gone through a lot of terms, but it basically comes down to three key skills, and we just practice those over and over and over again throughout a response to this component of the course. So first off, we identify. So we see, what can we actually see within the persuasive text? What arguments are there? What techniques are there? What tone is used? What word choices are used? And so on and so forth. Once we have undergone that process of identification, we then analyze. So that's where we consider, well, how do those particular components, how do those arguments, those techniques, those word choices work to make the audience think or feel in certain ways? And lastly, we explain that. So when we say, okay, I've found this particular technique, I said that it's designed to make the audience think or feel this way, then you undergo that process of saying, well, how does making the audience think or feel that certain way cause them to agree with the author? How does that achieve the author's purpose of causing the audience to agree? So that's basically it. That is an overview of analysing argument. It is just intended to be an introduction, but hopefully that gives you a little bit more information about what this component of the course is going to ask you to do.